The battlefield was silent now, but the smell of burning metal and plasma still filled the air. Sergeant Brian Carter moved carefully through the wreckage, stepping over broken mechs and fallen soldiers. His rifle was ready, the hum of its power cell steady against his shoulder. He was the last one left from his unit, the only survivor. The battle had been brutal. The enemy, the Drade, had attacked with overwhelming force, crushing their defenses. Now, Brian was alone in a wasteland of destruction, surrounded by silence. Or so he thought. As he moved forward, his helmet sensors picked up something, a faint movement under the debris. He raised his rifle, eyes scanning through the smoke and dust. Then, he saw her. A figure lay half buried under the rubble. Her silver hair spread across the ground, shimmering like metal under the pale light. Her skin was an unusual lavender gray. She was no human, she was a Lazarian warrior. One of humanity's strongest allies in the war. Brian rushed to her side, kneeling carefully. She was injured, badly. Blood, glowing faintly, stained her torn combat suit. Her eyes flickered open, stormy gray and sharp with pain. "Don't move," Brian said. "I'm Sergeant Brian Carter, Earth Marine Corps," the Lazarian warrior coughed, then managed to speak. "Kira Banis. 3rd Strike Force." She swallowed hard. "I can't feel my legs." Brian checked his scanner. It was worse than he thought. Her spine was damaged. She couldn't move. Military protocol was clear. Injured soldiers who couldn't walk were to be left behind in retreat situations. That was the rule. It was logical. It was the only choice. "Just leave me," Kira said, reading his expression. "Save yourself." Brian clenched his jaw. He looked at her, then at his tactical display. More enemy forces were approaching fast. The smart thing to do was run. The logical thing to do was leave her, but he wasn't going to. "Like hell I will," he growled. Ignoring the pain in his muscles, he lifted her from the rubble, adjusting his grip to keep her steady. Her armor, though battle-damaged, was advanced. It helped stabilize her, but she was still weak. "This might hurt," he warned. "I've had worse," Kira muttered. But when he moved her, she gasped in pain. "Perhaps not recently," Brian chuckled despite the situation. "Hold tight. We're about to make an extremely unauthorized escape." With Kira in his arms, he moved through the battlefield. Stepping over broken machines and craters left from explosions. She was light for a warrior, but the weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever. "You're remarkably calm for someone carrying dead weight," she murmured. "Marine training," Brian replied. "And you're not dead weight, still, flirting while dodging enemy patrols. That's impressively human, what can I say?" "I multitask." Brian ducked behind a destroyed mech as his scanner detected movement. Kira's senses were sharper than his. "Though they're hunting in formations," she whispered. "The ones you see are bait. Watch the flanks." Brian nodded. "Good to know." They kept moving. But just as they reached a collapsed building, Kira tensed. "Wait," she whispered. "Do you smell that?" Brian inhaled sharply. "Fuel. A lot of it, there." Kira pointed. "That transport, it's a military-grade ship. If it's one of ours, it might have a medical pod." Brian didn't hesitate. "Let's find out." They reached the wreckage. The transport was barely standing, its metal structure groaning from previous damage. Inside, a faint blue light pulsed. "A Lazarian healing pod," Kira whispered in awe. "These are sacred. They're rare, powerful. They can heal almost anything." Brian raised an eyebrow. "Sacred as in really effective? Or sacred as in might summon an ancient god?" Kira smirked despite her pain. "Both," Good enough for me. He carried her inside, laying her carefully in the pod. The device came to life, glowing softly as it scanned her. But Kira hesitated, looking at him with something like concern. There's something you need to know, she said. Our healing pods don't just heal. They bond two beings at a biological level. If you enter this chamber with me, we will be connected. Forever. Brian paused. Connected how? Our bodies, our minds. Even our genetics will align. Among my people, sharing this kind of healing is more binding than marriage. A faint violet blush colored her cheeks. Brian stared at her for a moment. Are you warning me or proposing? Kira laughed softly. Perhaps both. Outside, the sound of approaching enemies grew louder. They had minutes, maybe less. Will it heal you? Brian asked. Yes, she admitted, then the rest is just details. He stepped into the pod beside her. You surprise me, human, she murmured. I get that a lot. As the pod activated, a brilliant light engulfed them. Brian felt warmth flood his body, like liquid fire in his veins. He could feel Kira's presence inside his mind. Her pain, her thoughts, her strength. And she could feel him, his stubbornness, his protectiveness, his unshakable will to survive. When the light faded, Brian gasped. His body felt different. Stronger. And when he looked at Kira, he saw his own reflection in her stormy eyes, his brown flecks now mixed in them. I can feel my legs, she whispered in awe. Then she looked at him, eyes wide. I can feel you. Before either of them could say more, an explosion shook the ship. Brian's scanner flashed red. They're breaching the outer hull. Kira stretched her arms, testing her restored body. Then, a slow smile spread across her face, a fierce, warrior's smile. Then let's fight. Brian handed her a weapon, but something strange happened. As soon as she touched it, he knew how to use it too. Their bond wasn't just emotional, it was physical, tactical. They could feel each other's instincts, predict each other's moves. Well, that's handy, Brian said. Kira smirked. Many surprises come with a Lazarian bond. Guess I'll have to learn fast, he replied, charging his rifle. The doors burst open. Enemy soldiers flooded in. But Brian and Kira moved as one, their new connection turning them into an unstoppable force. Plasma fire lit up the room. Kira's energy blades sliced through enemies with inhuman precision. Brian's shots never missed. They were no longer just a human and an alien warrior. They were something else, something stronger, and as they fought side by side, a single thought echoed between them. Together, they would survive, together, they would win, and no enemy in the galaxy could stop them now. The last enemy soldier collapsed to the floor, smoke rising from his charred armor. Brian exhaled sharply, lowering his rifle. Beside him, Kira stood with her energy blades still humming, her chest rising and falling with each breath. Their bond had changed everything. He could feel her, her adrenaline, her focus, even the slight ache in her muscles. It wasn't invasive, more like an instinct, a sense of her presence in the back of his mind. She turned to him, eyes gleaming. That was exhilarating. Brian smirked. You mean the part where we almost died? Yeah. Thrilling. Kira chuckled. No, I mean this connection. I felt you. Knew where you were moving before you did. Knew where to cover. That's not normal, even for a Lazarian bond. Brian nodded. He could feel it too. It was deeper than just shared thoughts, it was as if their combat instincts had merged. Then let's hope we're the only ones who have this advantage, he said. The ship rumbled beneath them. A warning alarm echoed through the corridors. Kira's gaze snapped to the control panel on the wall. This ship is still connected to the Lazarian battle network. The Drade fleet is locking onto our position. If we stay here, we won't have time to escape, Brian cursed under his breath. He scanned the damaged transport. It was a mess, half the systems were fried, and the power core was barely holding together. We need a way out, he said. Kira's fingers danced over the holographic interface. There's a short-range fighter in the docking bay. It's damaged, but if we can power it up. A sudden tremor rocked the ship. Brian's scanner flashed red. They've landed reinforcements. More hostiles incoming. Kira clenched her jaw. Then we have minutes, not hours. She turned, moving with urgency. Brian followed, his grip tightening on his rifle. The docking bay was barely intact. Fires flickered in the corners, the metal walls scorched and cracked. And there, resting against the ruined hangar doors, was their only way out, an old Lazarian fighter. Brian wasn't an expert in alien ships, but even he could tell this thing had seen better days. You're telling me this can still fly? He asked skeptically. Kira gave him a sharp look. Would you rather walk through a Drade battalion? Point taken. She climbed into the pilot's seat while Brian scanned the area for threats. His mind buzzed with anticipation. Through their bond, he could feel Kira's focus, her hands moving across controls with precision, the ship powered up with a deep, shuddering hum. Energy flickered through its circuits, and the control panels came to life. Engines are at 40%, Kira muttered. Shields are at, well, let's just say, non-existent. Brian checked his rifle. So, no getting shot. Exactly. The hangar doors groaned as Kira activated the manual release. Outside, the sky was a deep, stormy blue, and beyond that, stars. Freedom, but just as the doors began to open, an alarm blared. Drade troops at the entrance, Brian report. He could hear them, heavy boots, clanking armor, weapons charging. They're not gonna let us leave without a fight. Kira's expression hardened. Then let's give them one. She powered up the ship's weapons. Outside, the first Drade soldiers rushed in. Brian didn't hesitate. He fired. The air was filled with plasma bolts and energy blasts. Kira controlled the ship's cannons, unleashing rapid fire that tore through enemy ranks. Brian provided cover, his shots precise, his movements sharp. The bond made it effortless. He could sense Kira's decisions before she even spoke them. When she shifted the ship's angle, he adjusted his stance instinctively. When she fired at one group, he already knew which enemies to take out next. The Drade had no chance. With a final blast, the last enemy was down. Kira slammed the thrusters to full power. The ship lurched forward, speeding out of the hangar just as explosions ripped through the wreckage behind them. Brian fell into the co-pilot seat, breathing hard. That was cutting it close, Kira smirked. Close is good. Close means we're still alive. Brian glanced at her. He could still feel her presence, strong, determined, but now tinged with something else, hope. She turned toward him, their eyes meeting. This bond we share, she said softly. It's not just a connection. It's something new. Something powerful. Brian nodded. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, he wasn't facing it alone, and together they were unstoppable. The fighter streaked through the upper atmosphere, breaking free of the dying planet's gravitational pull. Brian kept his gaze locked on the scanners, watching for any sign of pursuit. The Drade wouldn't give up easily. They're scrambling fighters, he reported. 6. No, 8 on our tail. Kira swore under her breath. I was hoping we'd have a little more time. She pushed the throttle forward. The ship responded with a shuddering burst of speed, but Brian could tell, it wasn't enough. These engines aren't built for outrunning an entire squadron, he muttered, then we don't outrun them. Kira's hands moved swiftly over the controls. We outmaneuver them. The ship lurched as she threw it into a sharp dive, skimming the planet's exosphere at an impossible angle. Plasma fire streaked past them, missing by inches. Brian gritted his teeth. If you're trying to kill me, there are easier ways. Kira smirked. Where's the fun in that? A proximity alarm blared, 3 enemy fighters closing in fast. Brian grabbed the co-pilot controls, instincts kicking in. I'll handle countermeasures. Through their bond, he could sense Kira's approval. The enemy ships opened fire. Plasma rounds exploded around them, lighting up the cockpit in flashes of red and blue, deploying decoys. Brian shouted, flipping a switch. A burst of false energy signatures scattered in different directions. 2 of the Drade fighters hesitated, just enough for Kira to roll the ship and cut through a narrow asteroid cluster. 1 enemy fighter miscalculated and smashed into a rock, detonating in a fiery explosion. Nice work, Kira said. Still 6 left, Brian reminded her. The remaining Drade ships closed in, their formation tightening. Then, something unexpected happened. Brian felt a shift in his mind, like a new awareness awakening inside him. His vision sharpened, his pulse synced with Kira's, and suddenly he knew what was about to happen before it did. They're going to force us into a pincer, he said, his voice steady. 3 flanking, 3 diving from above. They'll fire in a synchronized cross pattern to trap us. Kira's eyes flicked toward him in shock. How do you know that? He wasn't sure. But it didn't feel like a guess. It felt like certainty. Trusting the instinct, Brian reached forward and adjusted the ship's trajectory. Boost thrusters, now, he commanded. Kira hesitated for only a fraction of a second before obeying. The fighter shot upward in a sudden, unpredictable arc. Just as the Drade squadron fired, their blasts missed entirely. They're exposed, Brian said. Take the shot. Kira fired without question. The ship's pulse cannons lit up, shredding through 2 enemy fighters before they could react. The remaining 4 panicked, breaking formation. Brian exhaled. His heart was pounding, but his mind was clear. Kira turned to him, eyes filled with something between awe and confusion. That wasn't just strategy, she said. You felt it, didn't you? Brian nodded slowly. It's the bond. It's getting stronger. She studied him for a moment, then turned her attention back to the remaining enemy fighters. If that's the case, she said, gripping the controls, then let's use it. Together, they moved like a single entity, predicting, reacting, striking. Within minutes, the last enemy ship erupted in flames. Silence filled the cockpit. The only sound was their breathing, steady and synchronized. Kira finally spoke. That was impossible. Brian wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't a pilot, yet he had known exactly what to do. It was like his mind had merged with hers, not just thoughts, but instincts, experience, reflexes, and he could tell. Kira felt it too. This isn't just a Lazarian bond, she said quietly. This is something new. Brian looked at her. Then what is it? She shook her head. I don't know. But I intend to find out. The ship's long-range scanners beeped. A new signal appeared, a massive structure in deep space. Brian narrowed his eyes. What is that? Kira's face darkened. That, she said, is the Drade War flagship. Brian felt a chill run down his spine. They had escaped one battle, but the real fight had just begun. To be continued.